Even legends fall hard. Some albums weren't just bad, they were disasters. When great bands lose their way, the crash echoes louder. From overproduced messes to post-tragedy stumbles, these records left fans stunned and critics speechless for all the wrong reasons. Let's dive into the 8 most painful flops by music royalty. The myth around Chinese democracy began long before the album existed. After the explosive success of Use Your Illusion and the implosion of the original lineup, Axl Rose disappeared into the studio for nearly 15 years. Rumors swirled, millions were spent, and anticipation grew into obsession. When the album finally dropped in 2008, the reaction was immediate. How could this possibly live up to the wait? It didn't. Instead of the raw danger that defined Guns N' Roses, listeners were greeted by polished layers, sterile drums, and an overwhelming sense of control. The fire was gone, buried under technology and time. Songs like Better and Street of Dreams felt more like studio experiments than rock anthems. The band in name only was now Axl and a rotating cast of hired hands. Fans missed the chaos of Slash, Duff, and Izzy. Without them, the soul of the band had vanished. What remained was technically impressive but emotionally distant. Even those who admired the production couldn't ignore the emptiness at the core. It's not just that Chinese democracy wasn't good, it's that it felt like a stranger wearing a Guns N' Roses mask. The weight hadn't built anticipation, it had created a disconnect too wide to cross. What could have been a triumphant return instead became a cautionary tale in over-control and perfectionism. The album did earn some praise in hindsight, but the damage was done. A legend had been diluted by delay, and the myth crumbled on arrival. Chinese democracy wasn't just a flop, it was a fall from greatness. After Freddie Mercury's death in 1991, Queen's future was uncertain. For years, they remained quiet, releasing compilations and tributes. Then, in 2008, came The Cosmos Rocks, recorded with Paul Rodgers as lead vocalist. Rodgers had the voice, but he wasn't Mercury. The chemistry that made Queen iconic couldn't be replicated. The album lacked Queen's grandiosity. There were no layered harmonies, no operatic drama, no outrageous ambition. It felt stripped down and oddly safe. Songs like Celebrity and Still Burnin' sounded like generic rock tracks from a lesser band, not from the minds behind Bohemian Rhapsody. Rodgers was soulful and steady, but Queen had always thrived in the extravagant. Here, the restraint felt like fear of comparison, fear of failing. Brian May and Roger Taylor played with precision, but the fire was dim. The magic that once lifted them into the stratosphere now flickered in low orbit. Reviews were mixed, but the response from longtime fans said it all. This wasn't the Queen they remembered. It wasn't even a bold reinvention, it was a polite nod to the past, careful not to offend. And in that caution, they lost the spark that made them legends. The Cosmos Rocks wasn't offensive, but that was part of the problem. It left no mark, no lasting echo, just a whisper of what once was. In trying to move forward respectfully, Queen made their quietest statement and it barely registered. In the late 70s, Aerosmith was on top of the rock world, but with fame came destruction. By the time they entered the studio for Draw the Line in 1977, the band was deep into drug addiction and dysfunction. They recorded in a remote convent, lost in paranoia and excess. The setting was eerie and the sound reflected it. Draw the Line had potential, but it crumbled under chaos. The title track starts strong, but the rest of the album spirals. Lyrics were slurred, riffs unfocused, and energy erratic. Steven Tyler and Joe Perry were barely speaking, and the band's tightness had dissolved into disarray. Even Aerosmith admitted they could barely function during the sessions. They were trying to hold it together while everything else was falling apart. Producer Jack Douglas did what he could, but the result felt like a blurry memory too unstable to grab onto. Songs like Get It Up and Kings and Queens felt like rough drafts stretched into full recordings. The swagger was there in flashes, but never consistent. The album was less a performance than a cry for help, and the fans, who had ridden the highs of Toys in the Attic, couldn't ignore the downward shift. Draw the Line is the sound of a band losing its grip. Aerosmith would survive, even thrive again, but this album is the document of the crash before the comeback. And it's impossible to listen without hearing the unraveling. Can you hear when a band is falling apart in the music itself?
Before you slept.
When Jim Morrison died in Paris in 1971, the Doors were shattered. But just months later, they returned with Other Voices. Recorded shortly after Morrison's departure, the album arrived too soon. It sounded like a band in denial, trying to continue before they'd even mourned. Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger stepped in to handle vocals. While talented in their own right, neither had Morrison's presence, mystique, or unpredictability. The result was competent but lifeless. The poetry was gone, the danger dulled, and the voice of the Doors was nowhere to be found. Tracks like Tightrope Ride and Ship's W. Sails hinted at ambition, but lacked direction. They played like fragments of unfinished thoughts, songs made from obligation, not inspiration. The sound wasn't terrible, but it wasn't the Doors either. It was something else. A band trying to hold on to meaning without its core. Critics were polite but unconvinced. Fans were mostly silent. The cover, the marketing, the music all lacked conviction. It felt more like a side project than a rebirth. And while the band would try again with Full Circle, the magic was already gone. Other Voices stands as a quiet tragedy in the Doors' legacy. It's not a disaster because of its sound. It's a disaster because of its timing. Sometimes even legends need to pause. The Doors didn't, and the echo still lingers. By 1995, Black Sabbath was far from its seismic roots. Forbidden arrived during a strange, uncertain time for the band, fronted by Tony Martin, with Ice-T making a guest appearance, and Body Count's Ernie C. producing. This unlikely mix resulted in an album that sounded more like a lost demo than the work of metal legends. From its opening moments, something felt off. The riffs were dull, the energy limp, and the production sterile. Gone was the darkness, the dread, the grandeur that defined Sabbath's identity. Songs like The Illusion of Power stumbled between genres, unsure of their footing. Even the band's die-hard fans struggled to defend what felt like a parody of their past. Internally, the band seemed aware of the misfire. Tony Iommi would later call it one of his least favorite efforts, and critics mostly ignored it. It wasn't just a failure, it was a forgotten moment, buried under better records. And yet, its existence proved something important. Even giants fall. What hurt most wasn't that it was terrible. It was that it didn't even feel like Sabbath anymore. The signature sound had been replaced by something unfamiliar and unconvincing. In trying to sound modern, they erased what made them essential. Forbidden remains a cautionary tale of legacy dilution. Trying to adapt without purpose led to an album so lost it almost erased their myth. Redemption would come years later, but not here. Cut the Crap wasn't just a weak album, it was an identity crisis caught on tape. Released in 1985, it bore the Clash name, but not the Clash spirit. Only Joe Strummer remained from the original lineup, and creative control had largely passed to manager Bernie Rhodes. The result was a lifeless, synthetic mess of an album. The production choices were baffling. Drum machines replaced live percussion, choruses were artificially inflated with gang vocals, and the political bite that once fueled the Clash had dulled into sloganeering. Strummer's voice, once a beacon of resistance, sounded buried beneath plastic layers. Tracks like Are You Red, Why, and Cool Under Heat felt disconnected from reality songs built from fragments of what used to be revolutionary. Even This Is England, a rare highlight, couldn't salvage the wreckage. The band had lost its edge and its cohesion.
Happy when I'm on my knees.
Strummer later admitted the album never should have happened. He called it a mistake, something that didn't reflect who they were anymore. Fans largely agreed. The album failed commercially and critically, marking a sour end to one of punk's most important voices. Cut the Crap doesn't just represent a bad album, it's a painful, public unraveling. The final chapter of a band that once inspired rebellion became a lesson in creative mismanagement.
Don't wanna be an American idiot.
When Green Day dropped Father of All Motherfuckers in 2020, it felt like a band running from its own shadow. Gone were the politically charged anthems, the sprawling concepts, the emotional resonance. In their place came slick, quick tracks with almost no substance. It was loud, fast, and empty. The album lasted just 26 minutes, with songs that barely scratched the 2-minute mark. Tracks like Fire, Ready, Aim, and Sugar Youth offered high energy but low meaning. Critics and fans alike questioned whether this was satire, detachment, or simply a band out of ideas. Frontman Billy Joe Armstrong claimed it was an attempt to recapture fun, to break free from expectations. But that freedom felt hollow. What was once raw and defiant now felt like background music for a teenage commercial. The signature Green Day grit had been sterilized.
The subliminal mindfuck America.
Even the album art, featuring a unicorn vomiting a rainbow, seemed to mock itself. The irony, the cynicism, it didn't land. It wasn't daring, it was disoriented. The punk fire had dimmed, replaced by empty spectacle. Father of All Motherfuckers stands as a jarring misstep in Green Day's discography. A band that once defined a generation took a sharp turn into caricature, and the result was forgettable at best. In 1969, Philosophy of the World by the Shags quietly emerged and quickly became known as one of the worst albums ever made. It wasn't just unpolished, it was otherworldly in its disarray. The band, made up of 3 sisters from New Hampshire, had no formal training, and it showed. Their father, convinced of their destined fame, pushed them into the studio. What came out sounded like chaos on vinyl. Guitars wandered, rhythms clashed, and melodies seemed to ignore all musical rules. There was no harmony, no structure, no sense of where the songs began or ended. Critics at the time didn't even know how to react. And yet, something strange happened. Over the years, the album developed a cult following. Artists like Frank Zappa and Kurt Cobain cited it as a bizarre favorite, calling it so bad it was good, or at least fascinating. It became a symbol of outsider art, raw and completely untouched by convention. There's no question, musically it's a disaster, but emotionally it's pure. The Shags weren't trying to be ironic or different, they were simply doing what they believed in. That sincerity, however misplaced, gave the album a strange kind of charm. Philosophy of the World endures not because it's good, but because it's one of the most honest failures ever recorded. It reminds us that sometimes the worst albums still echo, just not in the way anyone expected. Even the greatest bands stumble. These albums weren't just unpopular, they were artistic detours, identity crises, and moments when vision clashed with reality. Some were born from grief, others from ego, excess, or desperation. But all of them left a mark not as triumphs, but as cautionary echoes in the history of music. If you love peeling back the layers of music history, the highs and the lows, don't forget to subscribe. We dive deep into the untold stories behind the songs you love and the ones you'd rather forget. Because sometimes the worst albums teach us more than the best.